For interactions, here we'll focus on SERT blockers because a lot of the pharmacodynamic interactions are really more for the SERT blockers talaga. So, for example, mirtazapine, you're less likely to be concerned about bleeding. Not necessarily zero risk, but less concerned as compared to, say, SERT blockers. So again, context is important. This is mainly a concern for those with concomitant anticoagulants, antiplatelets, plus don't forget the OTC stuff, the supplements. Because vitamin E, garlic, omega-3, those can also have a slight increase in bleed risk. So add that antidepressants, it stacks. So mind those din, mind the OTC stuff din. I'll talk about serotonin syndrome in the next slide and its difference between NMS, again, to highlight. CYP, we'll talk about that when we go to the individual antidepressants. NSAIDs, yeah, this is one OTC interaction you can highlight because the bleed risk mechanism for NSAIDs is different from serotonin. So serotonin is more platelet aggregation, NSAIDs is for COX, right? So those can be potentially synergistic. So mind that. And not just the bleed risk. Also, apparently, they can, let me move my head, they can reduce efficacy. This was based on a post-hoc analysis on the STAR-D trial. Apparently, they found that NSAIDs may potentially reduce efficacy of SSRIs. So to be safe, to reduce both risks, space apart the dosing na lang. To be safe. Okay? Yan, serotonin syndrome. I would rather show than tell. So, kasi it's very heterogeneous syndrome. So, there's autonomic dysregulation, the sweating, increased heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, but the very distinctive talaga is yung increased sensitivity ng reflex. So, you don't need a reflex hammer to elicit those reflexes anymore, for instance, if you know what you're doing, and the sustained clonus. Particularly when you differentiate with neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Besides the causative agent being serotonergic, look at the differentiating signs and symptoms. And then, as compared to NMS, where it's more lead pipe rigidity. Yan. Like yung Parkinsonism and the lead pipe rigidity. That's the main differences. Generally, this happens when you stack serotonergic meds. So it's not just SERT blockers, also even OTCs like dextromethorphan, tryptophan, ginseng, St. John's wort, those affect serotonin actually. And then prescription meds like Tramadol. Yan. Because Tramadol parent compound is an SNRI. They call Tramadol an opioid, but actually, did you know that the only reason Tramadol is an opioid is because it is metabolized by CYP2D6 to an opioid M1 metabolite. Tramadol itself is an SNRI. Its metabolite is the opioid. So Tramadol, serotonin syndrome risk is real there. So just be mindful of serotonin syndrome risk with these meds. St. John's wort, another supplement. For Triptans, though, the risk is theoretical. Generally, there may be very, very rare exceptions. We discussed this in the email thread with some mental health pharmacists. There may be some super rare exceptions that have not been caught on, but generally, it's not a serious concern with triptans. It's just a theoretical risk. Sumatriptan, etc. Okay. And just another thing, thyroid. The efficacy can be lowered, so be mindful of that then. Yeah, Tramadol is really a problematic drug. The only reason we use Tramadol is it's the most accessible non-S2 drug that can be metabolized into an opioid. It doesn't need an S2. That's the only reason we use it. If it needed an S2, I'd say take morphine over Tramadol. But it doesn't need an S2. It's more accessible. Now, for lab interactions, this is very important. So, if you're familiar with how urine drug tests work, they work very similarly to your some of the COVID test kits. They are rapid immunoassays. They use antibodies that will bind to the drugs present in the urine to see if to try to detect them. Unfortunately, the antibodies are not super specific, not like your monoclonal antibodies. These will often result in many false positives. That's why the gold standard for drug testing is liquid chromatography, LCMS or gas chromatography. This one, super daming false positives. LSD, for instance. You take an SSRI, bam, LSD in your urine. Or even if you're taking Desfen, bam, you're taking Shabu. This is a very poor test, I'll say. This is a very poor test. Very often irresponsibly interpreted test. I recommend checking out Mueller et al. In the references list. They give a very good overview of how to interpret urine drug tests, because here there's a lot of potential to misinterpret these tests and weaponize them against people you don't like.